to Science 12. We come to the closure of a whole series of presentations. The presentations, if you were to align them, do not form a linearity. There's a beautiful discussion of linearity and non-linearity in one of our science textbooks, in Black Holes and Time Warps by Kip Thorne, page 362 and 363. He has a box here called Non-Linearity and its Consequences, and it turns out that non-linearity doesn't mean that it's not a straight line. Here's what Kip Thorne writes. A quantity is called linear if its total size is the sum of its parts. Otherwise, it is nonlinear. My family income is linear. It is the sum of my wife's salary and my own. The amount of money I have in my retirement fund is nonlinear. It is not the sum of all the contributions I have invested in the past. Rather, it is far greater than that sum because each contribution started earning interest when it was invested, and each bit of interest in turn earned interest of its own. So when we're speaking of linearity, we're speaking about an arithmetical addition which is very simplistic and which is real only under very limited and special conditions. It turns out that lineness is a very unuseful functioning in the real world. I think it's been observed many times that nature rarely has straight lines or never has straight lines. This lineness that occurs is an inculcated educational cookie mold that's stuck in the mind and has been placed in the mind for about 2,400 years, that we still cling to these kinds of conceptual biases is now detrimental to our health. Our generation is convinced that non-linearity is some weird, wonderful, new kind of special circumstance, whereas it actually is almost always what obtains in reality. The development of this line, this linearity, this idea that the total size is the sum of its parts, comes from classical Greece. In order for us, at this juncture of our education, to really take the blinders off and to become practical, to become realistic, to be able to address the existential real in a realistic relationality, we need to use the template of our education for just a few minutes in order to get some coordinates that will allow us to understand in a more profound way what it is that these opening comments have had to say. And so we're going to come back and look at the overall structure of the education in just a moment. But first, I need to put an emendation in here. I need to put in a footnote, an asterisk. The ubiquitous distribution and the universal acceptance of mind forms of a particular reduced, consistent nature has produced a massive ignorance among the population of our kind on this particular planet at this time. So much so that people who consider themselves perfectly well educated, when interfaced with a real language, do not hear anything. They say to someone speaking in a realistic way, "I don't understand you, you're garbled." When it is they who are garbled and not the speaker. You can, as an experiment, take a tape of any lecture in this series and play it for any 10 intelligent people that you know. It would be very rare to have someone who could hear what was being said. You can take the tape transcript of any lecture in this series and give it to any 10 people to read. And it would be rare to find anyone who would be able to read it and say that they understood what was there. Because mostly the education here is a recalibration, reacclimation back to reality. Now, when this particular ideational limitation mindset was exported through trade routes, through travel, and first came into juxtaposition with whole cultures that had not been assimilated to it, at that interface in those arcs of geographic interpenetration, there were classic responses. For instance, when the Greek linearity, cookie-cutter, prejudicial, reductive thought first came into juxtaposition with India, in northern India, you had a response from the intelligence of India that saw the Greek linearity as a special kind of madness, which registered as a world-class delusion. And the Indian response to that was to develop Mahayana Buddhism. When that particular thought, the Greek linearity thought pattern, first impressed itself upon China, it was far western China, the Gobi Desert region, you had there an explosive response again, very much like Mahayana Buddhism in the Indian subcontinent, only in Central Asia, the response to the Greek delusion was to develop a kind of Manichaeanism. The Western Greek delusion was taken in its original form and returned back to a radical root of it. And out of the Greek Christian dogma, the Central Asian mind made a radical reversion back and turned it into Manichaeanism. The Chinese reverberation of this was to develop a sense of Taoism rather than just simply what had never even been given a name before. There was no Taoism before the 4th century AD in China. Actually, 5th century by the time it really registered. When this kind of delusion first hit the American Indian populations in the New World, their response was to develop vision quests that were meant to help their people go through whatever delusionary whirlpools were going to be created by this interface. Before that, the life pattern was so whole there was no need for a specialized vision quest. In our time, at the end of the 20th century, at the beginning of the 21st century, this kind of education is a massive futuristic response to a limitation that is now life-threatening. So if this education comes to you from the future, it comes to you from a different millennium from the ones in which the ordinary so-called mind was developed. So that its techniques, its applicability, are such that they normally would not make sense to you initially, and you have to acclimate yourself to them. It takes work. You have to recalibrate. It takes time. It takes a sort of a duration. Now, one of the techniques that we have used consistently is that instead of identifying some thing, a shape, a rectangle, a square, a circle, some kind of linearity, projective shape, we have taken a different tack. We've taken the tack that nature takes, that intelligence, when it's really smart, takes. And that is, instead of having single geometric shapedness projected by the mind out onto things, like some cookie cutter stamping out shapes, and only those will be baked. We take a different tack. We take the one that nature takes, the one that intelligence really takes. And that is that at the root of existence is a pair and not a one. And that at the base of development is a zero and not a one. So that the one becomes, for us, a focus which only occurs in a gestalt of interpenetration, of a zero base and a two algorithm, a pair algorithm. So that instead of having this one thing like an identity with which then one clubs everything in sight with your identity, that you must work from an unknown beginning, a beginning which is completely unknown, which is really zero, but that your development of acquaintanceship, of relationship, is on the basis of resonance rather than identity. So that relationality is much more important here than labeling. Now, 30 years ago, when these kinds of intuitions, when the feelings of this kind of quantum jump in consciousness, which is the way 30 years ago people used to talk, rather period-dated lingo, it's a jargon. Actually, what transpires here is not some quantum jump in consciousness, but a recovery of reality. And this recovery is almost like a discovery that all this time, that this was the true situation that was obtaining. And the techniques of the 1960s were very much based on affinities to American Indians, affinities to the high Chinese Tao, the affinities to the Indian Buddhists, the refinement of the Japanese Zen. All of these were culled as high points, as apexes of the response to waking up from the delusion, seeing through the illusion of getting into an alignment of actuality. In the meantime, in the past 30 years, all of this, because it was received by an unchanged body, by an unchanged feeling, by a mind that was still secretly convinced that it knew things and could find identities, and by a total lack of differential consciousness. Even the language cues, even the words, even the verbs, the entire grammar of 30 years ago has slid back into very comfortable molds with mind ideas, perfectly capable of using them with complete naivete and great confidence in the delusion therein. This has to stop. It doesn't have to stop because someone says it has to stop, but simply because there's no actual traction in reality. Nothing real happens on that basis. It can't. In the meantime, there are dynamics that are in play. There is, for instance, a tremendous landscape of history that is so dynamic that it's simply curling like a tidal wave over this particular generation, who seem happy to play on the beach, what they think is a beach. One is remarkably startled by an image, say, in a film like Peter Weir's The Last Wave, where the lawyer crawls through the sewer system of Sydney, Australia, and comes out on the beach and looks, and in his vision he sees this gigantic tidal wave, world-class tidal wave, not just a big wave, but an ultimate apocalyptic wave. It's that kind of a symbolic situation. Now, this education is meant to be not only a response to, but an alchemical interpenetration with the challenge. Because in a linearity, one has a situation and a response. One has an identity and an other. One has a subject and an object. And that what's insidious here is that instead of paired, resonant reality, one gets a polarity in which conflictive energies are taken to be normal. I'm reminded of a wonderful lecture when he was still brilliant, Chogyam Trungpa, when he was still young, insightful Vajrayana teacher, before he became ground up also in the melange. He was talking about why people fight and why they argue, and how the normal prejudice in the West is that people fight because they don't understand each other, and one should learn to make one's thoughts clear, of being able to express one's actual feelings. And he said, of course, what happens is that people fight more, because people fight not mainly because they don't understand each other, but because they do. And we know exactly that that person is wrong compared to us. And their wrongness is injuring us, imperiling us. They've got to go. It's them or us. That whole slide into degeneracy is done not on the basis of feeling, not on the basis of thought. It's not done on the basis of even sensation or even intuition. It is a structural ecology that occurs all by itself. And any one of those emphases are ineffective in addressing it. One has to take the reality of the entire ecology of this wave in all of its forms, all of its manifestations, in order to deal with it, in order to change it, in order to tune it. And even then, the language lies because it's not an it. So the problem becomes, as one becomes more and more alert to the possibilities, to the actualities, it becomes maddeningly more complex. The more that one understands what's going on, the more the complexity becomes inevitably increasing. So that a wisdom tradition takes this for granted, doesn't take it for granted in the sense of dismissing it, but assumes this as one of the basic platforms upon which all of the other structure, all of the other activity, all of the other growth is going to be posited, is going to be developed, is going to be, let's use the old occult term, manifested. But wisdom traditions throughout the entire history of this planet, and probably on any planet in any star system, recognizes that the complication of resistances growing asymptotically with the spread of realization of what's really at stake, of what really is counting. The only classic way to deal with this is to have a zero base as the common denominator of all ratios, of all proportions dealing with the problem, or even dealing with the solution, or even dealing with the problem and solution together as the big ball of wax. So that achieving a zero common denominator was always the step that one took in an initial way of not just adjusting, but of curing, of looking upon the situation in the 60s. One used almost glibly, and yet curiously, paradoxically accurately, one used the term dis-ease. That disease was dis-ease, not having an equilibrium, But that equilibrium turned out very accurately to be a part of the expression of a proportion, the part of an expression of a ratio. It was a universal structural characteristic that if one had a common denominator and one had a unique numerator, the relationship between those two was held by a line. If one even expressed that the ratio was 2/3, 2 as the numerator and 3 as the denominator, one cannot just write 2 above 3. You get a 23 written in Chinese style. You must have a line there. 2 to 3, 2/3. And that line turns out to be an actuality of equanimity. And that equanimity is there not because it's a thing, but it's there de facto because the manifestation of a numerator and denominator make in their relationality this interpenetration, which when the ratio is stable, turns out to have equanimity as the mediator between denominator and numerator. It turns out that universally, equanimity always holds its relationality. Now, one can see this even in the laws of mathematics. If you take some kind of algebraic expression and just say of this that this is A, it's not speaking of anything. It's just an algebraic expression that holds a place of consideration. Let's let A express something which is not yet designated. And let's have on an equal plane of expression, let's have B express something else. Now, if you take A and square it, one understands that the operation is almost apparent. And if you take B and square it, A squared or B squared, it's almost an instant accurate understanding of that phenomenon. But if you take A plus B as an expression and square that, you come out with a polynomial expression that includes not only A squared and B squared, but also includes A2AB. So that one writes A plus B, parentheses squared, equals A squared plus 2AB plus B squared. Where does that 2AB come from? It comes from the universal distribution of the function registering. That 2AB registers exactly where the plus sign would be. So that not only is A an expression and B an expression, but plus is also an expression that registers in reality. This is what is meant by concentration. That when you're looking at reality, you must be attentive to every operative element because all of it counts. Nothing is thrown away. Nothing whatsoever is thrown away. Mother Nature, it turns out, is a fantastic, parsimonious cook. When she cooks, she uses everything. There's nothing left over. And because there's nothing left over, always when Mother Nature cooks, a zero, a perfect zero, common denominator to any ratio is universally trustworthy. And because equanimity always registers not only as maintaining the shape of a ratio, but also participating whenever some kind of power, squaring, cubing, whatever, is applied to it, that common denominator and that common numerator and that equanimity also receive treatment. They also develop and progress. Now it turns out that in order to find an absolute zero in nature is extraordinarily rare. It wasn't until the late 20th century that we were able to find an absolute zero. And when that absolute zero registered, it registered in the Greek-trained mind as an absolute minimal one, called a singularity. A one which had only one property, which was oneness. A singularity. We would say now, in almost 1998, that a black hole contains at its center a singularity. Now, the original discovery of singularity comes many thousands of years ago. In dealing with symbols, one can come to a focus of perfect zero under very extraordinary circumstances. Just as in science, one under almost paradoxically similar and parallel circumstances can come to an absolute zero, which would be at the heart of the center of a black hole inside of its singularity. And in a way, symbols in science pair. They go together. So that in our education, the first year ends with science, the second year ends with, the first year ends with symbol, and the second year ends with science. If you come in halfway, the first year for you would end with science, and the second year would end with symbol. It can actually go either way. The prejudice of thinking that this course begins at the beginning is a linearity projection. It only holds for busy people that have calendrical schedules that they have to meet. In actual fact, the cycle is a double cycle and works all the time at any time that you enter into it. At any place that you enter into it. If you enter into it completely, there's such a thing as a distribution of equanimity. And a distribution of equanimity in nature has rarely this line, this straight line that appears between the 2 and the 3 in the expression 2/3. Mostly in nature, what you have are paired qualities, paired manifestations that interreact with each other in such a way that the equanimity is a limit of free flow that's shared between the two. In physics, it's called the Roche limit, R-O-C-H-E, named for Edouard Roche in the 1800s. If you have two stars, if you have a binary star system, the gravitation from each of the stars reaches out to each other, and there's a place where the gravitation between the two stars is actually very balanced and very equal. And it turns out that if you do a topographical map looking at the gravitation, one would find that at that equilibrium, in that double star system, The equanimity, instead of being a straight line, curves in a figure 8, in an infinity sign. And that usually in nature what you have is this kind of motion, this kind of infinity sign, so that the equilibrium is not so much a straight line in actuality, it's a straight line in a symbol abstraction. 2/3 is written with the straight line in a symbol abstraction. But in an application in reality, one would visionarily not see a straight line, but the 2 and the 3 are related by an infinity sign, by an infinity relationship between them. This gives you quite a different outlook. Now, you will not find in any textbook of the existent world ratios written with infinity sign instead of straight line, but in 100, 200 years certainly will be there. There's no problem with that at all. This education is a form where that infinity sign, that Roch limit, that distribution of equanimity is shared and distributed equally in all the 8 phases. So at the 8 phases, instead of being 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, or instead of curving around and making some kind of a circle where 8 comes back to 1, one has a shape where the 1, the 4, and the 8 all participate in the exact same centering focus, which means that the image-based linear mind used to an inculcated symbol, which it then projects out with an image referential and sees shape, is encumbered in such a way that it cannot see, is blind. Someone who has worldly eyes cannot see spiritual forms at all. They don't register at all. Or to put it in a non-religious educational language, someone with a linear mind could not see a differential form, even if you showed it to them. They're blind. They cannot see. Part of the root of compassion is to understand that they cannot see. There's no use, there's no sense in getting angry or disturbed at them because they are blind. They were blinded when they were babies by a culture which was blinded long before this particular culture even came into its phase, form, expression. And the civilization was blinded so quickly at its beginning that the blindness is endemic on many layers and levels. And compassion is very deep because one understands that the blindness is many levels deep. The joy is that at every single level, sight can be restored. One can be taught to see. One can be brought awake again on every single level. But that it takes a massive integrity of an application, because you can't just do one level and then hope to go to the next, because in that linearity, one would be blinded again in an even more subtle way, so that it would take some kind of super yogi to be able to see through. So one has to apply the medication everywhere at once, continuously, so that it all clears at the same time. This is what is called realization, when one finally sees for the very first time again exactly everywhere. This is called cleaning the doors of perception, a phrase that Aldous Huxley took from William Blake and applied to one of his books. Let's take a break and we'll come back. This kind of emotion always happens. It's like two phenomena when they have existential registry, when they're stably in time-space as forms, as things. Two things will always have a relationality between them, and in nature they tend to come together. This process eventually is the whole gist of what integration is. Integration. Coming together. So that nature, in order to have distinctness, has a counterbalance to this gravitational attraction. And that is that there is a repulsion built in on level of electromagnetic pressure, largely because of a magnetic registry of pressure, that bodies will influence each other and come together, but they'll come together in terms of a gestalt of movement rather than just dead on like this. When you have a phenomenon like a black hole is a gravitational collapse. And that collapse takes with it the magnetic fields, so that the magnetic fields, which are usually spread out in some kind of a, there's a chiral design, like zebra stripes arranged around a concentric center. And those magnetic fields become plastered to the surface of the black hole. And because that black hole then has no protuberances, not even magnetic fields, it's said to have no hair. The man who made up that phrase, John Wheeler, meant it to have a little bit of a vulgarity overtone so that people would remember it and not be so terrified at this terrible prospect that the universe has something so powerfully collapsed that not even magnetic fields can survive. So instead of giving it some demonic kind of name, like a collapsed reality, he said, well, let's use the phrase that they have no hair. If there are two black holes that are in proximity to each other, eventually they will come together. They will merge. The place where their merger begins to interpenetrate each other, there is an isobar of equanimity that surrounds both of them like a figure 8 that slowly comes to focus into a circle. There's a discussion of this sort of thing in Kip Thorne's book on black holes and time warps on page 359 at the bottom. If you get a chance to buy your textbook and look sometime, you'll see two black holes that coalesce over some period of time, and out of this coalescing comes a tremendous amount of radiation. And this is very difficult initially to understand because black holes are supposed to be so powerful that they plaster magnetic fields to themselves. How does radiation escape? And what kind of radiation is it? It turns out to be largely, in terms that we can detect, X-rays. The initial idea of a black hole, which we've talked about a couple of weeks ago and 4 weeks ago, and now we'll talk about again, and which our textbook has as its main theme, black holes and time warps. When black holes were first being seen, yet not named, first being mathematically appreciated was in terms of research for nuclear weapons. So that somehow the cosmological surprises of the late 20th century, the last half of the 20th century, are linked together with the development of nuclear weapons. It's almost as if the perception on some superconscious, far-flung sensitivity that there are black holes has some kind of a complement with the white-hot fireball of a nuclear bomb. And it's like that circle of darkness in the light of the heaven and this circle of brightness in the darkness of our social world are like some kind of vast Tai Chi. It's a peculiarity and has startled anyone who works in either of these fields, astrophysics or nuclear weapons research, and increasingly in the late 1960s and into the 1970s and then into the 1980s, it was an element of paradoxical contention that some of the great advances in astrophysics were made from intuitions of atomic weapons geniuses, researchers. For instance, Kip Thorne gives the detection of massive nuclear bombs. The US and the Soviet Union had had a makeshift moratorium for about 3 years, from 1958 to 1961, not to explode atomic weapons, hydrogen bombs on the surface, and in 1961, the Soviets exploded the most massive hydrogen bomb ever. And there was this crisis in the Pentagon that somehow all bets are off, and this was the build-up to what eventually became the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the United States experienced a tremendous crisis towards the latter half of 1961 and the first half of 1962, which oddly enough is about the time that Yuri Gagarin made his orbit around the Earth for the first time, sending man into space. But the emphasis in the Pentagon at that time was to send up unmanned rockets with some kind of detectors to find a way of detecting nuclear explosions, whether they're hidden underground or on the surface or whatever. And they found that nuclear weapons leave a signature of X-rays. And so there was a crash program put together. And however much money it takes, they were given on a crash program to develop the technology 1,000-fold sophistication in less than a year's time to detect X-rays. And when these early rockets with the X-ray detectors, they're actually like Geiger counters. They'll have a material that has the ability for waves that come through the cylinder to strip some electrons off the material, and those electrons in an electric current are drawn to a wire, and when the electrons touch the wire, they register and they make a count, one for each electron, and thus you have kind of a sophisticated Geiger counter. And when they sent up these super financed suddenly rushed technological detectors into space, they found that the most powerful detection was not on Earth, but was from the moon. And no one could imagine. The moon gives off X-rays, and then after whittling down from a 90-degree wedge of probability, they found it wasn't the moon, but in behind the moon at the time of the detection, there was a star in the constellation Scorpius. It was called X1, Scorpius X1, Scorpio. And so the first detection of an X-ray star ever happened because of trying to detect nuclear weapons. And through more sophistication, more improvement, the technology showed that there are many X-ray stars, and in fact, the most powerful of them is in the constellation Cygnus. And so Cygnus X1 became a fabulous puzzle for astrophysics, that somehow in the heavens, in these rare places, there were nuclear explosions that were so powerful that they dwarfed nuclear explosions right here on our planet. And because these sources were millions of light years away, tens of millions, billions of light years away, they must be truly staggering. Enormous beyond anyone's possible conception. How could this be? What could fuel? And you have to understand that the mindset at the time was that people were dealing with the most terrifying weapons imaginable, super hydrogen bombs, that make the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs look like pinpricks. And they were dwarfed almost into insignificance by nature. What's going on? And so the 1960s, the late 1960s, the advanced areas of human consciousness were suddenly haunted by a pair of incommensurate nightmares. One is that we have unleashed unbelievable powers in a social situation that is polarized and unstable. And on the other hand, this seems to be totally insignificant in the universe, which outdoes it by millions of times and does it seemingly in a characteristic fashion. The old confidence that heaven was a quiet place where the good God sits was absolutely shredded. I use Elizabethan pronunciation here, emphasizing each E in that. Shredded. Torn up. It took a while to realize that the universe had made a response to a limited mentality, much like Zen had made a response to it, or Tao had made a response to it, or Mahayana Buddhism had made a response to it, or the American Indians, North and South, had made a response to it, that the universe had also made a response to a mentality that was so limited as to be insane. A rationality so narrow as to be brittly mad in terms of reality. And that instead of being very powerful all of a sudden, able to destroy life on this planet, we had to face the fact that we were low-grade idiots in terms of a very real wondrous, a wonderland exponential. And that heaven was not a staid, quiet thing. People were secretly fearful that, my God, you mean we're just going to play harps on clouds forever? That was a stupid projection of their own static boredom, their own boring ego, that they would think that the heavens would be like that. Has nothing to do whatsoever It's like 2,200 years ago, the very first Jewish perception of heaven other than just the normal spread that the stars are there and God's at the center. The first crack in that was in the book of Enoch, where Enoch is taken to heaven and sees that the throne of God is some kind of fiery, jeweled beryl, B-E-R-Y-L, that fractionates and diffracts an intensity of light so much that one cannot even look at it. And in this kaleidoscopic interplay, Enoch discovers that the relationship of heaven to earth is so mysterious that he never even had a chance to even identify what was going on. And his vision in the book of Enoch became the basis for 2,200 years of a kind of an invocation of getting out of a frozen false consciousness into some kind of a magical, superreal consciousness. Eventually, in Elizabethan times, when the book of Enoch was filtered through 1,700 years of history, it was reflected in a place like England in a figure like John Dee. He thought that the book of Enoch must have some kind of abstract, occult symbolism, which would be an alphabet to the surreal, to the supernatural, and that one would have a magical language of Enoch in order to contact angelic presences. And even today, you find books for sale in 1998 that talk about Enochian magic and language. All of this is ego-fictitious projection from a mind so limited and so narrow as to be clinically fragile in face of any kind of whiff of real wind of the real. The fault is squarely with the educational institutions. They are the ones who had the responsibility, who should have carried through with the education and made sure that the population of men and women had at least some kind of basic relationship with nature, so that when it came to differential consciousness, they would have some way to at least begin to mature themselves. And there's no way whatsoever. So one hears of all the time alternatives. Alternatives to something that doesn't work, until finally one sees that this alternative itself has a history, and that the history of alternatives is much more complex and extensive than the history of the standard. And that the standard, in fact, is some kind of a fictive mentality that's inculcated only by a prisoner-type limitation of oneself vis-a-vis the wild oceans of a cosmos that has X-ray sources that dwarf hydrogen bombs from 10 billion light years away. All of this is a part of the way in which our education at the time of Science 12 comes into a play with two other focuses which happen exactly at the same time, simultaneously. One of the focuses is the very beginning of the course, Nature 1, and the other is Symbols 12, at the very center of the 2-year cycle. So that Nature 1, Symbols 12, and Science 12 are marks along an infinity sign which in its own way is nonlinear, so that that infinity sign actually collapses out of this linearity structure into an impossible to imagine triple focus. A triple focus which has a beginning, a middle, and an end, which simultaneously inhabit the focus together. You can call it a trinity. You can call it whatever you would like, but it has that classic quality, that classic scientia, the knowledge of it, that classic symbol, that meaning focuses in this way, and that classic nature that this is the traction out of which nature unfolds itself on a zero basis. Now, if we go back, if we take science and symbol as a pair, and we take the far end of science, science 12, and we go back to symbol 1, we have there a set of 5 stages. And if we start with symbols, science is a 5th phase. It's like the old alchemical term was a quintessence, a 5th essence. In the Chinese sense, a 5th essence occurs not by putting it last in the line, 5th, not by some clever manipulation of putting it in the center, but by understanding that the center is occupied by 3 and not by 5, not by 1. So that when you look at a Taoist energy cycle, it runs 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It has a different kind of a quality. If you stretched it out in a truncated mind that was trying to image it, it would make a Z-shaped rather than a line shape. That the center is there in the 3rd phase. That when you have a 5-phase energy cycle, the focus, the fulcrum, the pivot is in the center. Well, of course it's in the center. Of course it wouldn't be at the beginning or the end. It would be at the center. A Chinese phrase for a world-class vision of civilization is that the king occupies the pivot of the 4 corners. The pivot being there in the 3rd phase. In a Tao cycle of 5, the 3rd phase is Jin, human-heartedness. That this Anahata chakra, heartedness, has a fulcrum to it in terms of a 5-phase energy cycle. But that 5-phase cycle, we've seen in our education again and again, always exceeds a frame of reference. The mind, when it's inculcated to a linearity, always reverts to a square of attention. It always uses that as the basic pattern of regard, like the French phrase, regard. That when one looks to see anything, to see what's going on, to see what's there, in terms of nature, one always comes to this kind of square of attention. One always comes to a frame of reference. And it's only when that natural cycle includes the beginnings of consciousness that you get a 5 quality. Like the Chinese music scale of preference is a pentatonic scale. so that the 5, the thumb, goes in the middle. And there occupies that middle as 3. So that what would have been the 4th becomes now the 5th. So that there's a recalibration, there's a shifting over. When one goes from a purely natural outlook to a conscious outlook, you have to recalibrate and reconfigure every relationality. That's why it transforms. It changes its form. It's no longer the same. It looks different. It plays out differently. And one of the ways is like this. We read on page 18 of our pamphlet again, under symbol, words which we saw a year ago and which now read with more dimension. The symbol is the integral culmination of nature, brought into a focus at the soul center of the human psyche. Symbols do not represent something else or anything else other than themselves. They present themselves, which is the focused meaning which they are. The self symbol is the archetypal symbol. On this scale of comprehensiveness, there's only one symbol, one self. Each one has one, and the one is the one of one. Notice here that this kind of a language is language of singularity. Notice that a language of integration that carries integration all the way through to its ultimate compactness achieves, in terms of nature, a singularity. So that here, at the very end of the cycle of nature, we have at the very center of the human mind that achieves consciousness, we find a singularity that's there, that occurs. At the very end of science, we find also in the cosmos at large a singularity. Now, initially, if you read in Kip Thorne's book, initially about the time of the First World War, when Einstein's theory of general relativity was first being broached to a number of people, there was a mathematician named Carl Schwarzschild who first envisioned that there could be such a thing as a collapsed star and worked out the mathematics, only it was so offensive to people like Einstein and others that there could be a collapsed star that would be completely imploded upon itself. The Schwarzschild singularity we now know is the circumference, threshold, the horizon of a black hole. Was not even thinkable at those times. We now know that indeed the Schwarzschild singularity is not a mathematical singularity at all, but that the center of a black hole is a true singularity. But in order to appreciate that, consciousness needs to be self-reflective on cosmic scale. It has to take the cosmos as a whole in order to think of a center which is a singularity like the center of the black hole. Otherwise, there's not enough maturity to be able to conceive that, to get there, to realize that. One's reminded of a passage that Carl Jung put in his Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. When he was a young man, first getting into supranormal powers, into meditation, into concentration, to where he could drop out of the normal world that was completely illusory and delusory in terms of the deep psyche. When he was able to drop into the deep psyche, into this extraordinary state, the state of the extraordinary, there was this pressure of a thought that came to him that he wouldn't let register. He would not let himself think this thought. It had something to do with God. It had something to do with God in the sky of heaven, seated over this cathedral, and something was about to happen, and he would not let himself think that thought because it was terrorizing to him. It was too much. And it took him a long time. It took him decades of maturity to be able to come to be able to focus and let that bad thought be thought. And you can read in Memories, Dreams, and Reflections and see what terribly dirty, vulgar thought that he had about God. That God participates in a digestive system that results in a feces. It's like some primordial realizations are so ordinary that they become extraordinary the more that one retreats away from reality and becomes bunched into the narrowing angle of a cone of supposed sophistication. That one doesn't become backed into a corner so much as one becomes backed into a focus of all the corners, of all the impossibly acute angles, of an unrealistic, unnatural, unconscious assumption about what's going on, of who we are vis-a-vis of what's going on, and the world is seen not through rosy tinted glasses, not even some kind of kaleidoscopic reduction where every color is rose, but through some kind of fractally chaotic, fragmented reality that we suppose is true because we have made it so. And we sit at the apex of this fractured collection of aligned angles of a distortion and feel secure. The only position that's secure in that at all is the misfocus. That's the only place of security anywhere in reality of that kind of focus. Whereas what is truly secure is any other place other than that. That is the only brittle place in the entire universe. And the truth is that remaining there at that egotistically arrogant, fractally misfocused misunderstanding is the only danger point in the entirety of the cosmos. And so there's a paradox, like an ultimate paradox that occurs. And deliverance, or salvation, or freedom, or realization, or enlightenment all involves shifting from exactly and only there to any other focus. And enduring the rush of shame, the rush of ridicule, the rush of fear, the nightmarish pressure that it's all over. And realizing that it passes. And it passes so quickly, so completely as to not leave a trace. There's not even a smudge. There's not even one micrograin of soot anywhere in the universe where you were. You were not frazzed to an ultimate cinder speck. In fact, nothing was frazzed because nothing happened. The shift to the real leaves completely untouched, vacated without a trace, that place that you thought you were and that your identity had the most complete certainty. It's exactly the only place where you weren't real. Because it was a delusionary, imaginary misfocus. I'm reminded of a cartoon that British magazine Punch carried about, must be 35, 40 years ago. Had this squiggly little character in an optometrist office. Had this pair of glasses on, squinting towards the letters on the wall. And the next one had even bigger glasses and still squinting. And the next frame had 3 pairs of glasses on. He was still squinting at this. The fourth frame, the optometrist was wondering what's going on, and the guy without any glasses was able to read it. In the 5th frame, he's kicking the guy out of the office. We never needed glasses to be real. We never needed to be other than who we were to be certainly protected, because we were a part of everything that really exists and really happens. Where would we fall out to? As God says to Job, provision has been made for all this already. We would never have opened up this show had we not have covered these production values. Do you think that we're naive? We're professionals at the real. This is what God tells Job in the 1998 version. You're insured. It is 100% out of your hands, thank God. There was nothing that you could do to induce reality to be untrue to itself. Try though you did. You tried to brainwash the squirrels even to say, well, you don't need trees, you can eat nutrient pills. It's more efficient. Did they listen? No, they never listened. I remember meditating in the Sierras one time, and I was on this rock in the Western Sierras, and there was this huge sugar pine next to me, about 200 feet high. There was this Douglas squirrel up there, and sugar pine cones are huge. And it was chewing on this thing. So in my meditation, I hear this, no. And one of these sugar pine cones came thudding down right next to the rock where I was and bounced up onto the rock. There I was, came out of that samadhi, and I suddenly got this mad idea that if the squirrels, these little Douglas squirrels, can eat these pine cones, maybe they're good, super health food. So I took a bite of a green sugar pine cone, and it was unbelievably ghastly. It's like a combination of clay, red pepper, and gasoline. It was I couldn't believe, and my respect for life forms shot sky high, that these little guys live by gnawing this crap. It's the same with desperate, neurotic hopelessness. The only hopelessness is that you remain hopeless. There's no reason anywhere on any horizon to remain there at all, other than the stubbornness that there must be a reason, otherwise I wouldn't be here. That is the only reason, and that's a reason which is a false knot, because when you pull on it, when you pull on that form, it results in equanimity, not in a knot. And that equanimity instantly distributes itself in an infinity which includes everything in the universe. That Ruch limit includes everything which is in relation to that which you have become, which is literally everything, including all the relationalities as things. This quality then comes into a different focus. On page 292 of Black Holes and Time Warps, Kip Thorne comes to the very crux of his book, that black holes have something to do with time warps. And because time is intimately integrated with space, it has something to do with black holes and space-time warps. It turns out that black holes have such a tremendous gravitational collapse that instead of space-time just being curved, space-time around a black hole curves itself into a kind of a form which, if you took a plane, a cross-section, that cross-section would have a torus-like donut quality to it, like half a torus. That its true sphericality is almost unimaginable. It's a kind of a sphericality that if you took a cross-section, it would be this kind of fountain-flowing half torus. That an equanimity would be literally a fountain of wholeness. And that somehow that translates and prorates itself to the way in which the space around a black hole in total actually is, not just a cross-section. But then we have to add another dimension, is that black hole spin. So at that whole curved space-time that has been brought into this impossible to imagine trigonometry, when you add a spin to it, the whole structure of space-time twirls. It's like a dancer with a long train who spins, and the train spins around them. Space-time spins. It doesn't just twist, it twirls, but it twirls in the way almost like a tornado, like the wind in a tornado, so that space-time itself becomes like a tornado around a black hole. And in that tornado, a particle of anything, let's say a particle of light, a photon, that comes into this whirl is not only whirled by the gravitational attraction of the black hole, but is whirled because the very fabric of space-time itself is whirled. But that whirl, that swirl, becomes tighter and tighter the closer that one comes to that black hole. The folds in fabric become tighter and tighter to an infinite degree. So that the particle coming in goes into this kind of spiral that becomes so infinitely tight it would seemingly take forever for it to make any kind of egress or ingress. So that to an observer from the outside, it seems that there's a point at which the whole ensemble becomes frozen. In fact, the Soviets used the term frozen star for many decades before Wheeler, in his bathtub, came up with the name black hole. Wheeler, very humane kind of genius, understanding that you have to demagnetize the symbol, because when you get into frozen star stuff, it's okay if you're atheistic Communist Party hack, but if you start to think in terms of archetypally frozen stars, you get into all kinds of mental blocks that in fact did happen. Human beings cannot think beyond mental blocks until they learn to recalibrate. You can't get beyond mental blocks in terms of the mentality that you had that made that block. You cannot get there from here as long as the here remains. You have to transform the very fabric of the here in order to get anywhere at all, it turns out. That you cannot leave this here until you transform the very structure and nature of here, you can't get anywhere. The only thing frozen is you. The only frozen star is the ignorant mind caught at its fractionated angle of isolation. That's the only frozen star there is. The only death that's anything at all is that dunce seat of ignorance. Dunce seat because the only thing one needs to do is to get up and walk away. You don't have to have any reason to do it. You don't have to have any motivation. You can just simply do it. But the neurotic conviction of ignorance is that that's exactly what you dare not do. So black holes and nuclear weapons have a lot to do with archetypal, egotistic dead ends. That all three of them belong in the same mythic horizon. There's like a beginning, a middle, and an end to a whole mythic outplaying of a theme which is universal. We'll talk about it next week because the course doesn't end with Science 12 but ends with Interval 8. And Interval 8 is the Bhagavad Gita. The Bhagavad Gita is a classic Indian response, like Mahayana Buddhism, to this challenge of polarity constellated by a superior, linear, geometrized worldview. The Bhagavad Gita is the way in which one transforms this ultimate polarity into a complementarity that seems unreal and impossible to the ignorant. If you can make it, I'll be here.